anything remotely like a lecture. Uh, we're all too old for that model of communication. Um, and what I want to talk about is I guess the thing that stimulated the club's membership, the club's leadership's interest in what I'm doing is an article I wrote for the Atlantic Monthly last year, almost exactly, published pretty close to a year ago. I think it may have gone up in April. No, March. So it's almost March 11th. So there you have it, a year ago. And I was responding to what was then um, a pretty clear move in the Republican leadership, the upper ranks of the Republican Party, to try and characterize the then emerging COVID American, arm of the global COVID pandemic as as something that sort of preemptively they couldn't be blamed for. Um, Donald Trump at that point was already on record saying, this is making me look bad. This is a problem. I don't want, he didn't want to allow a cruise ship to dock because it would make the American numbers look worse. There was a sense in which that purely from a political standpoint, the emergence of an epidemic was something that was a problem for the Republicans. I mean, whether, I'm not saying that that was true or not. I mean, I'm not making any statement about whether that belief was correct. I am simply observing that it was held. So quite early on in the sort of sequence of the news flowing out on the pandemic, you had a number of communication strategies that came out um, that were designed to sort of minimize the role of government, and in particular minimize the governing responsibility of those in power for whatever was happening. And I'm sure we all were there, so I'm sure everybody remembers that a certain amount of this was achieved or was attempted at least by simply downplaying the risk of the virus. You recall, it's no worse than the flu. It'll be over. Larry Kudlow, perhaps, but senior advisors to the president saying that it'll be over soon. Donald Trump himself will say, one day you'll see it'll just be gone. These kinds of things. So there was an attempt simply to say that whatever had happened in China and whatever had happened by that time was starting to happen in Iran and Italy. This wasn't really a serious problem. People shouldn't worry about it. No worse than the flu, right? So that was one side, basically saying, don't worry, nothing's bad. We're in the middle of this election season. It's a political year. Don't pay any attention to people trying to create a political issue over what's in essence a minor familiar respiratory virus, familiar type of respiratory virus. So that was one side of the strategy, and the other side was to ensure that if however bad you thought it might be at this point, that it would be clear that the problem wasn't anything that was happening or not happening in Washington, but really the responsibility for this lay with the true cause of the emergency, and that wasn't the nature of zoonotic diseases and the history of global outbreaks, or anything to do that. One of the reasons you don't want to necessarily go down that road is because there's actually a very good public health handbook, as it were, born of experiences, some of which I'll talk about later in this period, in this time we'll share, that we could have invoked. And while it is a big bad global pandemic with with a significant fatality rate and all, COVID, as we've all lived through it, it's a really big bad thing. But the latest estimate I just saw today, that literally an hour before this started, was that on the order of 400,000 of the 550,000 or so deaths in the United States could have been prevented by an aggressive use of, again, nothing, no great revelations, no great innovations, a well rehearsed, well understood response to the problem of epidemic infectious disease. Again, I'll talk about that later a little bit. So the fact that this epidemic was happening and that people were in fact getting sick and people were dying in the United States, I think pretty much, anyone in the White House and in senior political ranks in the Republican Party recognized that this could become something that was an actual liability, and so the attempt was to find somebody to blame that wasn't them. And it was, by late February, if not earlier than that, when in fact the pandemic still seemed small in scale. Though again, if you knew the epidemiology of such things, the people who were expert were saying this is a big deal and it's really scary and we should be doing stuff. And again, this was known in the White House too. We have subsequently found out. So it didn't necessarily publicly appear yet to be a hugely destructive event, even though those who were particularly knowledgeable in this area were aware of what was about to happen. But anyway, you have this problem. So what do? You try and find somebody else to blame. You can't really politically blame the virus itself. You can't blame some animal in a jungle as a reservoir. That doesn't work. So whose fault is it? Well, in this period, late February, early March, there was a growing, clearly, I don't want to say, in a conspiratorial sense, a sort of organized response, but a number of people hit upon the notion of saying that it's China's fault. And in the more conspiratorial ends of the political spectrum, which we've seen play out more and more since then, there were rumors of deliberate malice, a lab constructed organism released deliberately by the Chinese, or these kinds of suggestions. But at least at the sort of broad public level, the notion was that China had misplayed its epidemic, had failed to do lots of things that it could do, and that if other nations were suffering, if the United States was suffering, it was because of failures and misdeeds by essentially China's officials. And the way this was sort of communicated, without saying this out loud all the time, though sometimes, and again, not necessarily the big high-profile people were saying that and more, was just simply to make sure that the virus was understood as the China virus, as the term is now, or then as this sort of strategy was just kind of this tactic was rolling out, the Wuhan virus. And so as I don't know if this article was circulated in the club or not, but Paul Gosar, who was a influential Republican House member of the House, and Secretary of State Pompeo, Tom Cotton, who's a senator, started using this term more or less at the same time, calling it the Wuhan virus. So I was moved to write an article about this. And I was for two reasons. One is that more broadly than just with China or Chinese people or East Asia, there is a long-standing pathology in human social life to label the other as sources of corruption and contagion. And this was That's the rhetoric around Jews in pre-Holocaust Germany. That was, very much. I mean, again and again, you can find in New York, in the history of New York, and in the late 19th and early 20th century, similar terrible statements about the Irish and other immigrant groups. And here it was happening again. And this is something that I wanted to make sure was sort of shoved hard into the conversation as quickly as possible, because it's a terrible political tactic whose often deadly results we have every reason to fear. We know this is a bad thing. We know this produces a kind of radical hatred that puts that sort of tears society apart and puts less powerful groups at direct risk. And I didn't want to see this happening. But it's also in the United States, this kind of rhetoric specifically directed at Chinese immigrants has been present for well over a century, and has had deadly consequences. And there's a sort of, if this may be too fanciful, there's like a reservoir of this pathology that gets trotted out, and will continue, I believe, to get deployed as the geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States, continues to play out over the next years. I think the othering of people from East Asia is something that's ready to hand for demagogic domestic American political purposes. And I really wanted to contextualize just why the use of the term the Wuhan virus, as it was more prominently then rather than the China virus, was so potentially virulent and needed to be really pushed back on hard by, and I'm going to use value-laden terms here, by every decent American. It is indecent. It is immoral, in my view, to use this rhetoric with a view to distinguishing between good victimized real Americans and evil Asian bearers of this terrible scourge. That's just a terrible construction to bring into political conversation, into civic debate, and we need to jump up and down and point and shame those who purvey such nonsense. It's not nonsense, but purvey such maliciousness. So context. Well, it turns out that COVID isn't the first global pandemic to reach the United States in consequence of globalized interconnection of economies and societies. We're actually still in what's sometimes referred to as the third plague pandemic, and it's sort of a outbreak of disease that probably originated in the late 18th century in quite remote rural southern China, and it mostly stayed there for a century, slowly showing up in small outbreaks, moving ever closer to the coast until it reached then Canton, now Guangdong, in the last sort of third of the 19th century. And from there, the Western powers, of course, had spent a fair amount of time, led by Britain, since the 1840s, in quote, opening China, and increasingly integrating China with an unequal status in a global network of trade, which means also a global interchange of people. So if it reached one of the 3 or 4 greatest ports on the coast of China, and started moving, it moved actually all around the world. By 1900, um, just before 1900, 1898, a ship reached Honolulu carrying at least one person who suffered who was in the early stages of an infection. That at least one person went ashore, went to Hong Kong's Chinatown, and an outbreak happened there in Honolulu. This is, by the way, right after American settlers in Hawaii had overthrown the last Hawaiian monarch, and to be followed a couple of years later by the U.S. annexing the result of this coup. So you have plague appear in Honolulu a few days after the first, not necessarily the index patient, but the first person to die of the disease died. A few more died, and the American authorities in Honolulu decided that the only way to deal was that the cause of the disease was some defect in the Chinese. More was known about the disease, but not by these folks, but not by the people in power at that point. And they cordoned off Chinatown, and they tried to, light a fire to set up a fire break between Chinatown and the rest of Honolulu. And the fire got out of control and burned the entire Chinatown down, displacing at least 45,000 people. And of course, not getting rid of the disease. Couple years later, the same thing, a similar sequence of events happened in San Francisco's Chinatown. Public health officials in California were aware of the risk. The city fathers really wanted to avoid a public announcement of plague in San Francisco, which was a boom town at that point, quite wealthy town. Things change and some things stay the same. It's still something of a boom town, and it's still, it's demonstrably extremely rich, with great inequality, to accompany that. And I won't retell the whole story. There are several good books about the San Francisco plague, but basically, first it was denied. The diagnosis of plague was denied. Second, it was portrayed in San Francisco, both political utterance and in the newspapers, as a Chinese disease, and white people didn't need to worry about it. And then some white people got it. So it was the Chinese. It was the fault of the Chinese. The terms that were used in some of the newspapers were really grotesque. Let me see if I can find one of the quotes that I put in that article. One of the newspapers called Chinatown a foul spot, and the only way to get rid of the menace is to eradicate Chinatown from the city and give the debris to the flames. And a member of the San Francisco Board of Health basically said we should set up concentration camps. Quote, every Chinese in Chinatown ought to be removed to a detention camp somewhere in the hills.
I have a question.
I think we have a question.
Where? Oh, please.
Yeah, it's Lester. Before I ask you the question, I would like to know whether you are eventually going to talk about the flu of 1918, which is sometimes called the Spanish flu.
Right. I can certainly mention it. I hadn't planned to go there, but I'm happy. The interesting thing about the so-called Spanish flu is one of the things that's certain is it didn't originate in Spain.
That's exactly the point.
And
it started in Kansas, I think, at an army base.
That's one of the possibilities. There's some evidence it may have not actually started there, but certainly the American outbreak did not. It didn't start from Spain, and the disease wasn't carried from Spain or Europe to here. It's not clear where it came from. The Kansas occurrence has been suggested as sort of the index case, but it's not clear. It's not certain that it is.
Okay, so my question then about the Spanish flu is that it's a misnomer. Mm-hmm. And you've been talking about the current pandemic being mischaracterized as Chinese. So in your opinion, when historians write about the flu of the 1920s, should they avoid calling it the Spanish flu for the
Yes.
same reason that the current one should not be labeled as a Chinese flu?
Yes, I do think that.
And
I mean, the interesting
yeah,
question is, I mean, somebody in various arguments that I've heard about that is you know, what about diseases like Ebola and Marburg, for example, which are in fact place names? Um, and you know, there are a couple ways to answer it, which is, you know, you can say, you know, hemorrhagic fevers, and you can say, you know, this as COVID is COVID-19, coronavirus, you know, variant, you know, 20, novel coronavirus 2019. You could do something simpler with, you know, hemorrhagic fever. It's certainly true that the African origin of Ebola was weaponized as part of a political attack against President Obama. There was a lot of you know, right before the 2000 and I think 14 elections. I'm actually the historical sequence is eluding me right now. And there was a lot of, you know, the coincidence of a Democratic president who was black and a disease that, you know, originated in Africa and was only arriving in the United States because a black president allowed people to travel from that region to this one, including people who were ill with Ebola, was you know, the subtext of that wasn't very sub, and so you know, but I don't think the name Ebola was the problem there. I think it was the fact that it was clearly located in Africa. It actually wasn't a global pandemic. You know, it'll be interesting to see if, you know, heaven forbid, you know, one of these, you know, COVID is 1 to 2% mortality in most instances. Obviously, it gets worse if you overwhelm a hospital system. You know, Ebola, now there's a vaccine and there are treatments, but at the, you know, if that particular pathogen had escaped, you know, from its region, that, you know, it's very, very high death rate post-infection. So, you know, I have no idea. Well, I suspect there would have been huge social dislocation, as there was in the places where the disease did get into human populations. But broadly speaking, and this is true, I think, in the epidemiological and public health community, for just the reasons I'm talking about, there's now a strong emphasis on not naming diseases by location, but by, you know, their sort of biological, you know, type, and that's clearly the right way to go. I mean, one thing that, you know, I've really been thinking about this a lot lately, and it's going to appear in my book, is, you know, the vector of disease now is you know, globalization, global capitalism, if you will. It doesn't matter, you know, zoonotic diseases have happened in the in North America, in South America, in Australia, in Asia, in Africa. You know, it's like there isn't anywhere where you haven't had a zoonotic disease. And, you know, once you get these novel diseases moving between species and moving between human populations, you know, it's no place in the world is more than, you know, some number of hours away by jet, right?
right.
So naming something by, you know, nominal location, not only do we, in many cases, not know where the true first case of that was, there was ongoing work in, you know, with COVID itself. Did it actually first, you know, appear in the markets of Wuhan, or was there, as there, you know, there's now some evidence, endemic in that more general area for some time until, you know, the conditions were right, the circumstances just hit it just right. to create a larger flare-up that then imposed all its misery on us.
Thank you.
And just it doesn't take an actual disease to produce the rhetoric of disease to victimize some people to achieve short-term political advantage. I mean, you remember Donald Trump during his campaign in 2016 talking about the immigrant crisis of the day, referred to Mexican rapists who were carrying infectious disease with them. That was part of the rhetorical universe that was created in 2016 that helped shape the results of the election, and in grim irony probably put us in a position where we had an administration that willfully chose not to actually govern in the face of the virus. But I see in the chat there's a question. I've been monitoring the chat. I'm sorry. I'll get Eric. What?
You want me to read it, or can you see it?
I've got it. No, I just opened the chat, and I'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to finish this thought, which is that the rhetoric of associating disease, infection, corruption. Again, if you go back to older and even medieval, look, Hitler wasn't the first to blame the Jews for social ills. During the bubonic plague outbreak of the Black Death century, Jews were routinely blamed for poisoning wells or so forth, and there were devastating pogroms and race riots or religious riots directed against European Jews, who were characterized as the corrupting, infectious bearers of these social ills, social disasters. So this isn't a new problem in American politics of the last decade. This is something, as the plague examples from the turn of the 20th century show, as much longer history I think shows, and as we see now, is a problem that results in two things. One is victimization of the group that's being targeted, but also if you focus on a spurious claim of this kind of transmission by unacceptable human, as it were, you do a very poor job of dealing with the actual way the disease does its, finds its victims and spreads through a community and all that. The question: the COVID-related firms, UK variant, Brazilian variant, South African variant, are in common use. Are these acceptable? Doesn't this usage pattern provide permission to use other location named disease? What can people do to change this pattern? It's a real problem, and it's clearly understandable why people would do this. And in a global pandemic, yes, the virus will evolve in different ways to different mutations in different locations. Though you may also, and I think this has already been seen in at least a couple of the variations, see similar mutation events that produce similar or identical variants in two widely separated locations. What can you do about this? Because it's if you start seeing it as in Britain, you saw the British variant, and then it basically took over that particular pandemic, and is now in several states in the United States doing much the same in terms of which genomes are represented when you sequence those viruses. I think in a global pandemic that's understood to be global, it's less consequential to associate particular events with other events. But really, this is a huge problem for exactly my profession. I'm a science writer for the public. My colleagues are writing about this out in the world. How do you communicate the underlying truth, which is that everything evolves, and you impose selection on any population, you will see a response in that population to evolve around that selection pressure. That what we're seeing is not as, the specific examples of it begin localized, but the phenomenon is global. How do you communicate that? There's nothing special about the fact that a given mutation showed up in South Africa first. It could have shown up in Brazil. There are actually variants associated with Brazil. So I don't know the best answer, except that science, right? One thing that is in the world that I'm part of is that science writers have to do, I think, a better job than they have done. There are some very good ones who've been emphasizing that this is a purely natural phenomenon, and it's driven by the fact that we've allowed the pandemic to get so far out of control that there is this, the numbers are large enough to permit these, mutations to spin up. Okay, and then asking another hard question, Patrick Tan to everyone. But SARS was not geographically linked, but everyone associated it to China, Southeast Asia, where it was a huge problem. Thoughts on this? I actually don't think everyone associates it with SARS in this sense. When you say it's the China virus, you're saying China is to blame. I do not think people associate SARS with a malign act on the part of a specific, or a malign act or a defective quality to individuals or a certain group of people in China and Southeast Asia. So I'd push back on the notion that the circumstances around SARS are the same as the circumstances around calling COVID the China virus. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's certainly my perception. What I'd like to do now is we've been talking now for close to 40 minutes, and I don't want to try your patience, and I haven't really talked at all about my emerging project yet. So I want to just take, I'll cut much of what I was going to say, but I'd like to talk a little bit about it because I think there's something that generalizes out of what I've been thinking about a perspective on infectious disease that actually goes back to the 17th century. That really, I've sort of already hinted at it, but it's something I'd like to sort of bring out in a little bit more detail for maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 more minutes. You tell me, and then we'll sort of open the floor to general questions. I'm working on a book that is under the working title "So Very Small," which is a line from a kind of satirical poem by Hilaire Belloc, an English poet, called "The Microbe," that was written in 1912. So really kind of very close to the period that's the hinge of my project. And I'll just read you the beginning. "The microbe is so very small, you cannot make him out at all. But many sanguine people hope to see him through a microscope." And then he goes on, "His jointed tongue that lies beneath 100 curious rows of teeth," and all this sort of fanciful description of no bacteria that ever lived. But it finishes, "But scientists who ought to know assure us that they must be so. Oh, let us never, never doubt what nobody is sure about." So Belloc is, as he was wont to do, is basically poking fun at everyone, those who are all excited by microscope. Anyway, So Very Small is about hinges on the development of germ theory in the 1870s and 80s. Germ theory was the sort of final resolution of the question is what causes actually a large number of infectious diseases. In the first ones where this was identified, there was cholera in chickens, which was Pasteur's work, then anthrax, which was Koch's great breakthrough, and then a whole bunch of other diseases very rapidly. Pasteur and Koch and others identified specific bacteria and demonstrated that they weren't just sort of present as riders along some other pathology, but were in fact the cause, the disease-causing pathogen, cholera, TB, most importantly for that period. Well, cholera had been a global pandemic with 5 great waves in the 19th century. or four, at the time of discovery, 4 great waves, with the 5th about to start. And tuberculosis was the most feared and really, enormously deadly pathogen that was just sort of creating huge consternation in Europe. Viruses, of course, were not yet seen. They were too small to be seen in the microscopes today, and the viral side of infectious disease took a little bit longer to work out. But what was really, so I first thought about writing a book just about that core moment, because it's really, what Koch and Pasteur were pushing against in terms of prevailing medical theory was really interesting. And at the same time, it was just this huge, it's a lovely competition between the two. They were great rivals. I thought all the elements of a story, but one thing kept bothering me. And that was the connection between bacteria and disease was firmly established in the 1870s and early 80s. But it wasn't that bacteria itself were a new discovery. As you may know, bacteria were first seen and identified as a distinct class of living organisms in a fairly short period of time, starting in the early 1670s. So it was almost exactly 200 years between the discovery of bacteria, mostly by Antonin van Leeuwenhoek, the great microscopist Draper of that period. And it's 200 years from Leeuwenhoek's work to Koch and Pasteur's. What took so long? Infectious disease was, a huge scourge all along. The Royal Society, which is where Leeuwenhoek reported his work, had just lived through the Great Plague of London, right? Bubonic plague was one of those diseases for whom the bacteria that caused it was going to be identified in this great first flurry of germ theory research. There are lots of other infectious diseases. Women were dying of puerperal fever, which was turns out to be a bacterial infection that affects women, especially in childbed. Soldiers would survive a wound on the battlefield and die, days or weeks later of some, terrible ongoing disease. We now know there are bacteria, associated with those battlefield wounds. And there were plenty of, patients doing, plenty of victims of these terrible deaths, terrible pathologies between 1670 and 1870. Most preeminently, most strikingly in some ways, in what in some ways is one of the first modern wars in the American Civil War, right? You could argue that the Crimean War had some of the same characteristics, but certainly the Civil War did. So I want to know why that was. And because we don't have much time, I'll just, without going through all the lovely, terrible stories that are going to populate my book, the argument I'm developing basically says the issue wasn't intellectual. We're not smarter than, Isaac Newton and his cohort in the 17th century. We're not smarter than, all the brilliant people that, the Semmelweis or I'm blanking on the name, John Snow and all these others who were trying to piece their way towards what would become germ theory. We have more knowledge, but we aren't actually brighter than they are. So, so the question is, what took so long? And the answer, it seems to me, lies with not an intellectual issue, not a scientific question of, failure of scientific instruments or the, development of theory or what have you, but rather with a broader understanding of cultural, social understanding in which the scientific communities of the day shared on the role of human beings in nature. This in the pre-germ theory days, you have concepts like the great chain of being and a hierarchy in which God and the angels are above, human beings are those next to angels, and below us is the world of nature over which we have dominion. And if I'm right in arguing that, or if I'm plausible, you can't be right or wrong on something so general. If this is a persuasive argument, then what I'm saying is that one of the reasons it was hard to make the observational connection between bacteria and disease, microbes and disease, because conceptually, culturally, it was very difficult for people to think that something so exotic and gorgeous and tiny, this microcosmos in which people like Leeuwenhoek and his successors, his gentleman amateur successors, were kind of tourists, you know, seeing what wonders lay there in the same way that, you know, the explorers of the macrocosms were, bringing back wonders to entertain, you know, the rhinoceros in London and the depictions of the South America that Humboldt saw, and all these were scientifically serious in many cases, but were also presented to the public as entertainment. So these tourists in the microcosmos, I think, didn't have the sort of cultural theoretical framework to understand that something as insignificant as these little cute dashing motile creatures could do something like damage us so severely as to give us cholera or whatever it may be. And again, because we're basically, I think, at the limit of time, I make the argument that we still suffer from the same thing today. And I think you can see that right now with COVID. Very similar mental block, as it were, though expressed in terms of post technological, post medical breakthrough terminology. Once you had germ theory and knew what was causing the disease and could devise means to prevent it, from proper sterilization technique and surgical cleanliness, and then ultimately, of course, antibiotics, which came into general use in the 30s. At that point, you kind of have another way to say that we have dominion over nature. We are the technological creature. We're obviously vastly, if we're not smarter than our predecessors, we are vastly smarter than a bacterium or a virus. And we can use our brains to build tools that will defend us in this war against infectious disease. Well, that proved not to be the case with antibiotics. We are in the midst of a slow rolling, I think, very dangerous sequence of events in which antibiotic resistance is becoming increasingly an impediment to increasingly a challenge for medicine to deal with. And you see in the COVID virus exactly what we were just talking about with the South African variant and the British variant and all that. We're going to beat the virus by vaccines. I mean, the entire Trump administration strategy was not to worry about the public health issues, just get the vaccine done and then it would be over. But we forget that the virus gets a vote, right? The microbe gets a vote. It's evolving. It we do something, it changes. And it's a reminder that pure technology is unlikely to be the decisive weapon in this and in really, lots and lots of other. I think this is the sharpest audience I will ever speak to, a room full of, or a Zoom room full of MIT graduates. You can see the analogy in climate change and other things, that it's not enough to come up with great technology that achieves the task immediately in front of us. The social context of innovation needs to be there to support the innovation and not, vitiate its power almost before it's out there. I mean, it's really depressing. I got my first vaccine yesterday, and I'm really glad I did. I'll get my next one in 3 weeks. And I'm hoping I will be able to see my family in California this summer and all that, and it's great. But the South African vaccine actually has evolved to the South African variant has evolved to a point where it substantially evades the vaccine. So, to the extent that spreads in this area, we're under the same constraints. And yeah, I'm sure people very, much cleverer people than I will come up with booster shots and we'll play the sleep role. But unless we actually break the chain of transmission and reduce the ecological or the evolutionary playing field in which these viruses can shift on us, we're not going to have, we're not going to be rid of this problem for a long time. So, but the point here, of course, is that it's not how clever we are, but how socially clever we are that will determine whether or not we can handle these problems. We are not outside of nature, is what my book is going to argue. And I think clearly we're experiencing that now in the world. We are within nature, and if we understand that and accept our place as part of a web of interactions, then maybe we can get ahead of some of the things that most trouble us. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
I hope that was
Professor Levenson.
interesting.
Yes, we can open it up to questions if people have questions. So you can unmute yourself first.
Yeah, I agree with what Larry was saying about the convenience versus, the convenience of geographic names for viruses has to be we have, it's true, the soundbite 24-hour news cycle makes that sort of a ready fallback, but we really have to come up with different conventions and really try and impose them as a norm within the science communication field.
Excuse me, Tom. You say the social aspect to the solution to this problem. Do you think it's a political aspect, or is it something else? What do you think?
Well, if this were a classroom and a student asked me that question, I would say, well, what do you think? Because I'd actually like to know, but I also think it's a question that we all answer. Clearly, in the current U.S. Political context, this virus has been substantially politicized, and it's been done so actually at a bunch of different levels, from elite political discourse by leaders of the by elected leaders, prominent people, but also very much. I mean, this is one. We do live in a socially networked world, and the ways groups form and create persistent self-identity and maintain themselves as social organization really rewards imposing a strong partisan framework on just about everything. There's no empirical logic behind anti-masking, for example. But because anti-masking because an opposition to masking became a hallmark of Trump himself, and then lots and lots of followers in different subgroups and with different networks sort of pick that up as a way to sort of recognize each other, as it were, to form a group identity. And then sort of post hoc explanations for why masking is actually bad rather than good. You create this sort of complicated but really depressing feedback loop that derives from a fundamentally political choices, but also the particular shape of partisan politics in the United States right now. And around, I know about the United States, I'm here, as we all are, but clearly this is going on elsewhere, and it's really problematic. But look, epidemics are always social events, right? We get great literature out of epidemics, and you sort of see the first thing that any self-respecting epidemic does is test the bonds and sort of formal structures of society. You certainly could see it in the Great Plague of London, both the literature of it and the Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year was written 60 years, almost 60 years after the plague. Defoe himself did not live through it. He was younger than that. And it's this real social metaphor. Defoe is arguing, and he's doing so in the wake of a great financial crisis. The Journal of the Plague Year comes out just a couple years after the South Sea Bubble, which was this huge and really unprecedented fiscal, monetary, and securities market disaster for a lot of people. And that journal is in part Defoe's book is in part a extended metaphor about that collapse and the loosening of social bonds. So it's not new that we would see politics come up, both in the handling of a pandemic or an epidemic, but also in the retrospective sort of organization and analysis of it. You know, to me, the U.S. experience of the COVID outbreak so far has been a direct and unequivocal indictment of the administration in power at the time and a lot of the approaches of Republican governance. Other people, you know, genuinely see the response to COVID as an overreach of a nanny state that's you know, continuing to destroy the structure of American freedom. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that if you do any of the kinds of empirical analysis that MIT is famous for, you'd get one answer and not the other. But I don't find it surprising that we're having that argument.
So we are coming almost at the bottom of the hour. We have some in the chat. I don't know if you want to address one more.
Sure.
Good question there.
As a science writer, what are your thoughts on the antidote to the large threat of anti-science? I'm not sure how to read that. Well, one of the things we know is that just telling people they're wrong doesn't help. You know, completely unpersuasive. Another thing we know is that often the more technical, you know, that in many cases, the more technically educated you are, the harder it is to use simple evidence to persuade somebody. You know, engineers who get an anti-science perspective are amongst the hardest people to persuade out of it. And we also know there's a Dunning-Kruger effect where people think they are more capable of making a given analysis than they may actually be. You know, there's a Lake Wobegon problem throughout humanity. Everybody's above average. So how do you communicate it? Well, one of the things we always say is you do it by telling stories. You locate the argument in a person and an incident and people striving to get something. Another thing that I think, that though it hasn't really been well tested, but one of the reasons I approach most science writing through a historical lens is both historical events are less immediately controversy posing. I mean, I don't think any of I don't think Ted Cruz has a strong view on what happened in the San Francisco plague outbreak of 1904. I don't think I could persuade Ted Cruz that he's wrong about just about everything, but I'm willing to bet I could tell him the story of the plague and he would not immediately leap to a contrarian position. And one of the great things about history is they do two things. One, they remove some of the immediate political controversy out of it. And two, they allow you to go back to when certain problems that are really, really difficult in many cases are simpler. It's certainly true in doing, sort of pure science writing about most things. But I wrote a piece for the Boston Globe's a couple, 3 years ago now, that didn't argue with people about climate change. It basically just said there are a certain number of facts that we know about the global climate system that are unequivocally facts, right? We know that the physics of carbon dioxide produce the thermal effect that people look at as the mechanism by which the planet might heat up. We know that carbon dioxide levels have been increasing in the atmosphere because we've measured them directly. So the physics of carbon dioxide done in the lab, everybody, it's absolutely true. Same thing with, people have actually gone out for 60 years now, more than, to the top, to near the top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and basically every single day counted how many, or not how many, counted the percentage of carbon dioxide, the parts per million, in atmospheric samples, and they've done this continuously every single day for 60 some years, and the measurements are unequivocal. The line goes up like that. Actually goes up like that because there's a day-night variation. So we know that carbon dioxide. We know that carbon dioxide drives a warming mechanism. We know that carbon dioxide has been going up in the atmosphere, and we know where it's coming from with somewhat less precision than the actual measurement. But in fact, we know that you can measure not with considerable reliability how much land is being cleared, what the agricultural production, what the cattle herds are like, and above all, what the burning of fossil fuels is every year. And we know that the carbon dioxide that's appearing in the atmosphere is coming from these sources that are all derived from large-scale human activity. And what I said in the article is, you can come up with arguments, basically given those facts, the sort of first next step in the logic is that we're putting more carbon dioxide heats things up in the works as a heat retaining mechanism in the atmosphere. More carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, and it's there because of human activity. Any argument that says that won't result in global warming has to come up with a mechanism by which those three facts that we know are true don't do what the physics say they will. I said, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, but anything that you can't just say, oh, this particular, one of Ted Cruz's satellite data don't confirm the sea surface data. So tell me how you're going to get that heat out of the system, because we know the basics. Those facts are true. And that's not necessarily persuasive, but it sets up the problem in a different way that I think has some persuasive power. So if you go into history and you find the things that you really know and then make the argument going forward from that, you can do some good. But it's a really, it's not just science. I mean, the so-called fake news thing, it's not just science that is being distorted. It's all kinds of things. I mean, somebody really went with a gun to a pizza parlor in I think it was
Washington.
DC. Yeah, in DC, to shoot it up because he genuinely believed that there is a global cult, a global conspiracy of top political leaders who are kidnapping and killing children for some compound in their bodies. That's not a science writing problem. That's just a devastating problem for the American polity. And I don't know how to solve it.
Okay, looks like we are there. So Professor Levenson, on behalf of the MIT Club of Rhode Island, thank you so much for sharing your views, and very, it could be confusing, but I mean, it's also political. I mean, I know that we'll get through the virus, and everybody will take their vaccines, and hopefully, we can look forward to more outside events that we've previously held. But thank you so much.
It would be lovely. Yes, I would love to. At some point in the future, maybe when the book's out, the new book's out, I can come talk to you about it.
Absolutely.
In Rhode Island.
Absolutely.
If you'll have me again. Anyway,
yes,
thank
we
you.
will.
I enjoyed this.
Yes,
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm gonna say goodbye now.
Yes.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
very
Bye-bye.
much. Enjoyed it.